I'm Rod Giltaca. I'm the CEO of the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. The Canadian government is banning guns. But did they base their decision on real evidence? Or is the truth a lot different than Canadians think? We're about to find out. Good evening, and welcome to Gun Ban Canada Exposed. In this series, we examine the arguments used by the Liberal Party government to justify their controversial Bill C-71 and the massive May 1st gun ban. Tonight, we explore a central talking point used by gun control advocates virtually everywhere: that the proliferation of firearms means more firearm-related violence in society. In short, more guns equal more death.
We can't ignore the fact that if we make guns easier to possess and more accessible for people, there will be more guns, there will be more gun violence, there will be more gun injuries.
There are a number of studies that have shown within Canada there's very high correlation between the availability of firearms and firearm death and injury.
Canada must follow the example of countries like Australia and New Zealand, United Kingdom and Netherlands. Legislative action is needed to stop the proliferation of guns in Canada.
The more guns you have in a society, the more gun violence you will have. That's the argument. And on its face, it makes perfect sense. If there are no guns, there can't possibly be any shootings. Just like if there were no motor vehicles, then there would be no more car accidents and their accompanying deaths. Think of the benefits. There are 160,000 car accidents per year in Canada and roughly 2,500 deaths. But as in this example, life is rarely that simple. When we attempt to understand complex problems, the first thing we should do is look to science for answers, or at least some perspective to help us form the most correct opinion. People who are against private firearm ownership also claim to rely on science to inform their opinions.
The recent literature is unequivocal that injury, homicide, and suicide by guns happens more in jurisdictions and countries where there are more guns. And we know that countries with stricter gun laws have lower rates of gun homicide, suicide, femicide, intentional and unintentional injury.
So the good news is, everyone agrees that science and data should be the foundation of our opinion on gun control. Here's the problem. What we see day in and day out are scientists that start their investigation by looking for evidence that supports the conclusion they already have. It seems they'll only consider evidence that supports their preferred side of the story. That's not relying on the science. You have to consider all the evidence on the topic. So, let's see what's out there. A leading anti-gun advocate recently stated in a magazine article that we rank very poorly on gun mortality rates, much closer to the US than to other developed countries. This advocate is a Canadian doctor, in fact a trauma surgeon. She must be a trustworthy source of information. Unfortunately, here's the truth. The average firearm mortality rate of 40 countries with lower rates in Canada is 1.1 per 100,000 citizens. Canada's rate is roughly 2.2 per 100,000. The US, 12.21 per 100,000. So Canada ranks closer to the US than its peers in other developed countries. Obviously, this couldn't be less true. The fact that this kind of information is coming from anti-gun advocates and worse, a doctor, is beyond troubling. But this isn't the only science she quoted in that particular article. Following along the lines of more guns equal more deaths, she also declares that a child is injured by a gun every day in Ontario. She made the same claim as testimony to the Canadian Senate.
It's called The Risk of Firearm Injuries Among Children and Youth, and the senior author is Dr. Natasha Saunders. It comes out of the group at the Hospital for Sick Children, and it documents that over a 5-year period, 2008 to 2012, there was one child per day injured by a gun in Ontario.
If what Dr. Ahmed said is true, that would be concerning to any caring person. But strangely, she leaves out a few details. The subjects of the study, referred to as children and youth, include individuals up to 24 years old. When you're 19 years of age, you're considered an adult in Ontario. So why include all of these people that aren't children? But wait, here comes the worst part. Only roughly 8% of these injuries came from actual firearms. That's right. Almost all of these injuries referred to in this study came from pellet guns, airsoft, paintball guns, or even toy guns. She didn't mention that. On the website for the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, they clearly inform the public that a child or youth is injured by a firearm every day in Ontario. They use the word firearm. Look at this infographic they created to go with the study. It clearly says that one child or youth gets shot every day in Ontario, and they show a toddler pointing a handgun. What would you suppose the average Canadian is thinking when they see that? Is this what the study actually showed? The media calls the study groundbreaking, and they show imagery of real guns, crime scenes, police dogs, yet no images of 15-year-olds playing with paintball or shooting cans with a pellet gun. These doctors and scientists know full well that virtually no Canadians will ever read this study and will trust them when they say that children are being shot with firearms every day in Ontario. You now know that this claim is entirely untrue, but it's already out there, and many people likely believe it. Having a problem with professional behavior like this is not attacking the science or attacking doctors. It's expecting that one of the most trusted and honored professions in our society acts in a way that doesn't betray our trust in them. When we return, we've only scratched the surface of our investigation of the science that more guns equal more death. Before the break, we heard that the evidence is clear, it's unequivocal, it's even overwhelming, that the proliferation of firearms means more firearm-related violence. When academics or doctors say these things, we believe them, of course. But what if the evidence were truly none of these things? That would bring a lot more into question than the debate over guns. An up-and-coming anti-gun group made up of activist doctors laid out a list of 19 studies. They refer to this collection as proof that Canada needs to ban guns. We paid a researcher to go through every line of every one of these papers. You can download the fully referenced report on this investigation at firearmrights.ca. It's called Intellectual Malpractice. This list of 19 studies actually was a myriad of opinion papers and policy statements, journal articles, and then a few actual studies. And you guessed it, the pediatrician study that we just talked about was included in this list. Only 7 of the papers were Canadian. The majority, 11 out of the 19, were from the United States. Here are some key takeaways from our report. Number 1, opinion papers, editorials, and policy statements are not evidence of anything. Some of the editorials even refer to other editorials as evidence. Number 2, none of the evidence supported the doctors' group's call for a gun ban. None of the actual studies recommended it. And number 3, studies from the United States have very little relevance to the Canadian conversation about guns. Every aspect of firearm ownership in the United States is completely different than it is in Canada. The reasons you can legally own guns, the regulatory system, why people own them, all entirely different. A good example of this is also the only real credible study on the doctor's list. It's called Global Mortality from Firearms 1990 to 2016. It's a US study, but it brings together an enormous amount of data. And the authors concluded this: background checks are useful, and so are safe storage regulations. No gun bans called for, nothing that supports the conclusions of our activist Canadian doctors. And by the way, Canada implemented background checks as part of Bill C-51 back in 1977 and safe storage in Bill C-17 in 1991. The recommendations in the one study that stood above them all have been in place in Canada for a minimum of 30 years. On the other side of this debate, there's been substantial research done here at home in Canada. We'll have a look at 2 studies. Both were headed up by Dr. Kaylin Langman, Assistant Clinical Professor of Medicine at McMaster University. Both of his studies are peer-reviewed work, apparently the gold standard in research. The first was published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence in 2012 and examined whether or not all of the firearm regulations implemented in Canada since 1977, including licensing, had any effect on the homicide rate. The study concluded that it didn't. It's surprising, but it's true. This is some of the most relevant data we have because it's Canadian and it focuses on actual firearms, not toys and paintball guns. But this verified true information is ignored by anti-gun groups, including the anti-gun doctors. Why? Shouldn't this be a key piece of information to determine whether or not the proliferation of firearms means more firearm-related death? Wouldn't they be interested in the correct answer? 8 years later, Dr. Langman authored another peer-reviewed study, this one entitled Effect of firearms legislation on suicide and homicide in Canada from 1981 to 2016. This study is again the most directly relevant work on the firearms issue in Canada. The study concludes, no associated benefit from firearm legislation on the aggregate rates of male, specifically, suicide was found. Females use firearms in suicide 3% of the time, so it's obviously very difficult to correlate them with access to firearms. Also, no beneficial association was found between legislation and overall suicide or homicide rates. These are findings here in Canada as they apply to actual firearms. If anything is clear about the quantity and quality of the science used by anti-gun groups here in Canada, it is that it's nowhere near where they say it is, and that's a real problem. If we can't trust our doctors and academics, who can we trust? As we've seen, the lack of evidence to support gun bans in Canada drives these groups to interject American data and American politics into our conversation here at home. But is this tactic truly a benefit for these anti-gun groups? We'll take a look at that when we come back. When anti-gun groups want an example of more guns, more death, they always look to the United States. It's true, the United States has a very high firearm mortality rate compared to other developed countries, several times higher than Canada. But the situation there is a lot more complicated than you might think, and it might not be as supportive to the anti-gun argument as they might think. Americans have a lot of guns, some estimates numbering as high as 398 million for a population of around 330 million people. That's around 1.2 guns per person, the most guns per capita in the world. The United States must surely be the most violent country on earth. If you thought that, you'd be wrong. The US ranks 137th out of 230 countries, which puts them around the middle of the pack. Take a look at Mexico, for example, America's neighbor to the south. Mexico has extremely restrictive laws regarding gun possession. There's only one gun store in the entire country, and it takes a lot of paperwork and a lot of time to even have a chance at purchasing one legally. Mexico has licensing, registration of firearms, and limits on how many firearms a person can own, if they can own any at all. Yet Mexico's murder rate is 6 times higher than America's. They rank 12 places down from being the most murderous nation on earth. How is that at all possible if the availability of firearms in a society is a significant factor in violent outcomes? I think we all know the answer to that without having to be an expert in anything. It's obvious. Socioeconomic issues, instability, the resulting culture creates violent societies. Things like poverty, lack of opportunity, lack of hope, desperation. These are all common prerequisites for violence. They also happen to be the most common preconditions for the majority of suicides as well. Of the 93 countries with a higher murder rate than the United States, the majority of them have tighter gun laws than the United States and lower levels of legal firearm ownership. Consider this interesting anomaly. During a 22-year period between 1996 and 2017, the number of firearms in circulation in the United States went from 242 million to 392 million. That's an increase of 150 million guns in only 22 years. During that same period, the FBI reported that violent crime decreased by roughly 50%, and firearm-related homicides stayed relatively stable during that period. Again, how is that all possible? Keep in mind, this isn't a study involving a few hundred people or a poll of 1,500 people. These are conclusions involving hundreds of millions of people and entire countries. These are indisputable facts that you can verify yourself in a few minutes. Another intensely interesting situation is the growth of concealed carry permit holders in America. These are people who can legally carry a loaded handgun under their jacket as a means to reduce the likelihood that they'd be hurt in a violent confrontation. This is an idea that Canadians have been taught to enthusiastically reject, even though this is precisely the reason that we allow police and armored car drivers to carry handguns. It's for them to protect themselves in the execution of their duties, not the public. The Crime Prevention Research Center reports that during a very similar period to the one we just talked about, the number of concealed carry licenses in the United States grew from 2.7 million in 1999 to over 19.4 million in 2020. The increase is almost unimaginable. You might be surprised to find out there was no spike in firearm-related homicide during that period. You might also be surprised to find out that our anti-gun groups ignored one of the largest research projects on the subject in American history, It was done by the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, and was commissioned by President Obama via executive order and budgeted at $10 million. It was called Priorities for Research to Reduce the Threat of Firearm-Related Violence. It established that the number of instances of defensive gun use equaled or greatly exceeded the criminal use of firearms, and that gun use is the safest of the studied self-protective strategies. Here's a quote. Studies that directly assess the effect of actual defensive gun uses, i.e. incidents in which the gun was used by the crime victim in the sense of attacking or threatening an offender, have found consistently lower injury rates among gun-using crime victims compared with victims who used other self-protective strategies. It's worth noting that in the overwhelming majority of defensive uses of firearms, a shot is never fired. In these circumstances, it's likely that the firearm was shown and the criminal lost their incentive. A crime was avoided, nobody was hurt. Now, the purpose of highlighting this information is not to make a case for widespread concealed carry in Canada, though the evidence supports it quite soundly. The point is that more guns certainly do not equal more death. All of this flies directly in the face of everything Canada's anti-gun groups and activist doctors are telling us. How do they deal with this indisputable global evidence? They simply ignore it and continue using their talking points. After all, they're academics and doctors, so you should listen to them. That's their strategy. When we come back, we'll look at how some other developed countries manage private firearm ownership and how their experience can help inform us here in Canada. Stay with us. Welcome back. The purpose of the series is to provide the other side of the story that very few Canadians get the opportunity to hear. If we as a society want to solve problems that result in violence or suicide with firearms, we need to be honest and reasonable. So, to be fair, examining the case study of the United States provides mixed results. But the thesis that more guns equal more death is not by any means proven out by the American example. Now, it has to be acknowledged that the United States does have a high firearm mortality rate compared to its peer nations. There's a variety of reasons for that, but probably the most relevant one is that the United States has a very serious gang problem. In 2011, it was estimated that there were 1.4 million gang members operating in 33,000 known gangs. Think about those numbers for a minute. They should be shocking. And by some estimates, and it's hard to be sure, of the 8,000 to 11,000 firearm-related homicides per year that occur in America, up to 80% of them are gang-related. If you remove their gang-related homicides, their rate starts to resemble Canada's again. There are a lot of variables, and these numbers are not the whole story. But most people would be surprised at what they'd find if they look past the headlines and the talking points. On the other side of the equation, are there countries, first world countries, that have less restrictive gun laws and lower firearm-related homicide and suicide than Canada? Yes, there are, and one in particular is an interesting case, the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic is a member of NATO, an OECD country, and a member of the European Union. This is a sophisticated, developed, first world country. Compared to Canada, the Czech Republic has far looser gun laws. Citizens can own many firearms that are deemed too dangerous to own in Canada, and their firearms licensing scheme is shall issue, and that means that if a person or even a foreigner applies for a license, the government needs a specific reason not to issue the license to them. From a regulatory perspective, it means owning firearms is a right. The Czech Republic also issues concealed carry permits for purposes of defense, and again, these licenses are shall issue. When it comes to using those firearms for self-defense, not only is there no obligation to retreat from a violent confrontation, so it's a stand your ground jurisdiction, but the justice system acknowledges that in order for defense to be successful, defensive actions must exceed the intensity of the attack. In some very tangible ways, this resembles the self-defense doctrine of the United States. Now, if you thought all of this firearm and self-defense freedom has resulted in a more violent society, you'd be wrong. When it comes to firearm-related mortality, the Czech Republic ranks better than Canada at 1.64 per 100,000, opposed to Canada's 1.94. The Czechs also enjoy the 11th most peaceful country on earth, according to the Global Peace Index, which, by the way, ranks the gun control paradise of the UK way down at 45th place. Canada, with around 20 million guns in circulation, currently ranks 6th. Circling back to where we started tonight, do more guns equal more death? In just 30 minutes, we presented some incredibly compelling evidence to the contrary. So why would many Canadians believe that more guns do equal more death? Well, we know that the simplest messages tend to work the best, and we also know that it's very hard to question the word of doctors and academics because we're supposed to be able to trust them. It puts all of us in a very difficult position. But the fact remains, it's morally wrong to take the property and the rights of individuals without proper justification. You can't advocate banning things because you personally don't see the value in owning them. Neither can you say that you're basing your opinion on evidence if you'll only consider the evidence that simply works for you. The more you look at firearm-related mortality, the more you understand that it's not correlated with the proliferation of firearms. It's caused by gang activity and other criminal behavior, socioeconomic factors, poverty, unemployment, lack of opportunity. Solve your crime, suicide, and domestic violence problems, and you've solved your firearm problem. Next time on Gun Ban Canada Exposed, anti-gun activists keep telling Canadians that we need common sense gun laws. They keep implying that we don't have restrictions on firearm ownership or that our laws are too weak. But are they? We'll have a look at what they're saying and how close to the truth it really is. Until next time, thanks for joining us and good night.